Josh, we're so excited for yet another tour and to get to have this baby with us. For those of you who don't know, if you haven't been to one of these tours yet, my brother Josh is an Israeli tour guide. He made Aliyah in 2011. He completed the Israel tour guide course. And we're particularly excited because Pesach is coming up. And as we're going to learn about in a minute, Pesach was one of the three major holidays. Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot was a pilgrimage holiday when everybody would go to Jerusalem for the holiday. And the main place they would go, obviously, is to the temple. So we're going to be studying the Temple Mount and learning about the history of the Temple Mount itself. One of the things that I think has been one of the coolest parts of these tours that Josh has been running for us is getting to go to places that many of us might not be able to go to in our lives in person. We saw parts of the Sinai Desert. We were able to see parts of Syria when we were talking about the exile after Tisha B'Av. We've seen certain places that many people here maybe have been to, but I personally have not been to, and I don't know if I will be able to get to in my lifetime. So, Josh, thank you for opening up these parts of our world to us, opening up these parts of our history to us, and we're so excited for yet another tour. I'll pass it to you.
All right, great. Well, I'm so excited to be with all of you guys here today. It's really funny, I guess, that we're doing the tour of the Temple Mount now, because this is actually the second virtual tour that I built. I think I have around 17 tours. I think I can't remember, it's 16 or 17 tours that I've built over the last year. And this was the second one that I built and the one that I was kind of most excited about building. And somehow we missed it until now about doing it, but it's really one that is probably the most popular of all the tours that I've done, believe it or not, with many number of different communities and shuls from around the world. And it's really fun to do it with you guys here with Anshe Emet. And we have our own little Anshe Emet twist to it that we're going to be doing as well, which is really nice. So as we're getting started, so first of all, I guess before we get started, I wanted to thank you, Amy and Rabbi Russo, for planning this once again. It is really fun to work with both of you. It's the only time I ever get to speak with my brother is when we get to plan these things. I'm just kidding. It's just an excuse for us to drink together. So it's really fun when we get to plan them. So I wanted to take you guys here over to the Temple Mount because again, as David was saying, one of the three pilgrimage holidays, the first of the pilgrimage holidays, the most important of the pilgrimage holidays is Pesach, and it is one of the days that people would come up to the temple. Now, before we get started with a little bit about what the pilgrimage holiday is, I wanted to first to let you enjoy what it is to be, again, on these virtual tours where we get to be in places where you don't normally get to go to. Look, we're floating way above the Mount of Olives over here, the world's oldest active cemetery. There's evidence of burial on this cemetery that date back 5,000 years, and there's still to this day people being buried here. If you want to invest in some really hot Jewish real estate, you can only get a little bit of a plot of land here on the Mount of Olives, but it is worth quite a lot of money because it is the holiest of all the Jewish cemeteries in the world. We've got over here this little square that is the Temple Mount, but before we go there, let's spin around and take a look at what we can see off in the distance. You can see how Jerusalem is very much on the border between the city, between a place where there's natural rainfall and the desert. This is the Judean desert. Just on the other side of these mountains and hills over here is the Dead Sea, not so far away from Jerusalem. This is the Judean desert, literally just a stone's throw away from Jerusalem. You can even say that the dividing line between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem from 1967 can also be the dividing line of where the rainfall and the snowfall happens in Jerusalem. That one side, the east side of Jerusalem, in a way, is a little bit of a desert, and the west side of Jerusalem is not considered desert at all in the least. You can see some of the beautiful things on the Mount of Olives skyline that we could do a whole tour, maybe another day. But let's talk about the temple. Now, talking about the temple, let's just talk about a couple of terms here now that we're going to be using. What is most commonly used by the temple is the first temple and the second temple. What I'm going to talk a little bit about today is how the first temple and the second temple is a little bit of a complicated term to use. Now, the first temple is the one that was built by King Solomon in the year 930 BCE, approximately, the son of King David, who was granted permission by God to build the temple. And it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Now, 70 years later, according to Jewish tradition, some of the Jews who came back from Babylon rebuild the temple, and they build the second temple. Now, this temple wasn't really much to be seen. It wasn't really such an amazing temple, but it was still built and it lasted for a few hundred years. And then, as we discussed on our Hanukkah tour, the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, the heroes of the Hanukkah story of the Maccabees, they build the third temple, but really it's just a renovation on the second temple. So no one really calls it the third temple because the third temple has messianic implications to it. So they rebuild the second temple. Sorry about that. And they rededicate it.
Very excited about seeing these parts of the temple.
She's very excited about seeing little texts on the temple. Right. So they rededicate the temple. I'm really sorry, everyone. If only we remembered about this time zone thing, it wouldn't have been a problem. Anyways, so we have the third temple by the Hasmoneans, that they basically remodeled the second temple. And they expanded a lot. And then by the time that Herod comes around, just over 100 years after the Hasmonean dynasty, so he builds the temple even greater than it was before, even greater than the first temple itself. And this structure that we see over here, which you could call the fourth temple, but no one would call it the fourth temple. This is what people generally refer to as the second temple, but we can always imagine it essentially as the second renovation on the second temple, which is this rectangle that you can see, which when it was built by Herod, first of all, it was never even completed by the time it was destroyed in the year 70. But by the time it was mostly completed by the year, let's say 0, this was the largest building in the entire Roman Empire. That there is a good chance that this structure that we see here, which is a model of the Second Temple, which you can see in the Israel Museum, in Jerusalem, this huge, massive model of what Second Temple Jerusalem would have looked like, that this temple, the Second Temple of Herod, might have been the most famous building in the entire world. That is only after the destruction of the temple that the Romans essentially loot enough money from the gold from the temple that they're able to build the next largest building in the Roman Empire, which is the Colosseum. So, but what is the whole Temple Mount complex? As you can see over here, this little tiny hill, that's, if you look at the Golden Dome of the Rock, followed by the Al-Aqsa Mosque that you can see over here. And then you see this little hill that goes off to the side. So that little hill that's off to the side is the original city of David. Not my brother David Russo, but King David. King David, who is even more famous than David Russo, believe it or not. That King David over here, this was the Jerusalem that he would have known, which isn't that big of a city. And there's the temple that's up on the top of the hill. And Jerusalem basically is a pretty small city, as you can see over here in the first temple period. And it gets a lot bigger as the years go by. Just going to try a new position. All right, sorry about that. 1 second. Okay, let's see if this one works. Great. So, what you can see on the top today is something about the tour that we're going to be doing. And again, this is just a long-winded introduction, if you will, is that I'm not going to just look at the Temple Mount and only talk about the Temple Mount as, you know, the second temple or the first temple. I want to look at the Temple Mount and understand what it is today and the interaction between all the different groups of people and the influences between Christian and Muslim and Jewish history on the Temple Mount itself. And you can see this Golden Dome of the Rock over here, which was built in 690 CE, which actually makes it the oldest still standing Muslim-built building ever. That it has lasted quite a long period of time. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was built in 670 CE, is older than the Dome of the Rock. However, it is more susceptible to earthquakes, and so it has fallen over a bunch of times. So we're going to discuss that a little bit later on. But historians ask the question, why is it that when the Muslims came in the 7th century, why did they build the Temple Mount as it is today? Why did they build this Dome of the Rock? Why did they build the Al-Aqsa Mosque? And one of the answers is that in the 7th century, basically, as Islam was growing, there was a divide between the north and the south of the Islamic empires, that in the area of Syria, of the Umayyad dynasty, so they did not have the same amount of access to get to to Mecca, the holiest site in the world for Muslims, which is the Kaaba in Mecca, as you can see over here. This is the original version of it. and to the right is what it looks like today. And so basically the theory is that while these pilgrims weren't able to access the Kaaba in Mecca in the 7th and in the 8th century, so they would go to Jerusalem, to the next holiest site, to the third holiest site in all of Islam, and they would perform the Hajj, which comes from that same Hebrew root for the word Chag, holiday, and they would circle around. They would circle around the Dome of the Rock, kind of like how when they would get to the Kaaba, they circle around the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia. But for some people, they said that theory is good, but it doesn't explain why the buildings look the way they do, because domes are actually not a Muslim style of architecture. Domes are actually a Christian style of architecture. And so the theory is that maybe these domes were based off of the Hagia Sophia, the most famous church of its day in Constantinople at the time, now Istanbul. That this building over here, which was the most important church in the whole world, that the domes of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were meant to say, listen, the Hagia Sophia is really nice, but check out our domes. They're even nicer. Just a little bit of a side point. I do like how Jerusalem is unlike any other city in the world, where to show off your masculinity and your dominance, instead of putting kind of phallic images everywhere, like in every city in the world, that there's like a more of a dome, which is more of, I guess, a feminine image, but we're not going to get into kind of all of that kind of stuff. But that's besides the point. So you have this Dome of the Rock that's over here. And some historians say, well, the Hagia Sophia is really nice that there's a dome there, but there's a dome that's right next to the Dome of the Rock, which is this building over here, which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is at the time in the 7th century, this is what it would have looked like, which is the holiest site in the world for Christians, which resides right here in Jerusalem. That this here is the site where Jesus was crucified. This dome that's over here is the site where Jesus was buried and then later resurrected, more importantly, which makes it the holiest site in the world for Christianity. And it famously had a huge Romanesque dome. And so when the Muslims come in the 7th century and they conquer Jerusalem, they don't destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because they recognize that having the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a way to bring in those tourist dollars, the much coveted tourist dollars, then and now. So they don't destroy the building. However, they take the Temple Mount, which at that point had been converted into a literal garbage dump, and they say, we're going to make this whole area an even more amazing kind of Muslim structure, this whole Muslim campus, if you will, that people will come and they'll want to see both the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but also understand who is the real boss in Jerusalem. Our dome is bigger, to kind of put it in that kind of way. But now let's get into a little bit about Pesach. I've taken you far away from the Temple Mount. I've taken you all the way to in Samaria, to the north of about an hour's drive north of Jerusalem, in a place that this city that's over here is called Shechem in Hebrew, or Nablus in Arabic. And this is a mountain that's called Mount Gerizim. Now, Mount Gerizim for most Israelis is famous for having the best tchina in the world. Mount Gerizim tchina is absolutely delicious. And it is made by the Samaritans who live up on this mountain. The Samaritans, which is a very, very small minority in Israel. I think there's something around 900 or 1,000 Samaritans left that live in Israel, and half of them live here on Har Bracha, Mount Gerizim, which is again right next to Nablus, to Shechem. It's just above the city of Shechem. And this site that's over here is the holiest site in the world for them. Now, the Samaritans, I'm not going to get into all of the semantics of them. I got into a little bit on the Sukkot tour for any of you who were there, but they're essentially maybe a break-off or a subsect of the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, that they would never call themselves Jews. They would call themselves Israelites. Now they call themselves Samaritans because they live in the area of Samaria. And the holidays that they celebrate, the same Jewish holidays that they celebrate, that we celebrate today, they celebrate differently. And some would say are even more preserving of the ancient traditions of how Israelites and Jews would have celebrated these holidays centuries ago. And so, for example, on Shavuot, this is the site, the ancient archaeology site that we're on right now. This is the site where they go to on Shavuot on sunrise to accept the revelation from God. Now, in 2010, when I was in Israel for the year, I had the privilege of going to Har Bracha, to the Samaritans, on the holiday of Pesach, where they actually do the Korban Pesach, where they actually do the Pesach sacrifice. This is me and a couple of friends of mine shaking hands with a priest, one of the priests of the Samaritans that's over here. And all the Samaritans from all over Israel all gather in this little courtyard, and they have a prayer service that goes back and forth between the priests and the people in Aramaic. Is the language of the prayer that goes back and forth. And you can see these bars that are over here. So it's hard to see, but these bars have little tiny hooks on them. And that becomes important because at a certain point in the prayer, all of the men in the family lift up these huge swords and slice the neck of a lamb that just a couple minutes before, the kids of all the Samaritan kids were playing with all these sheep. They were, riding them and playing them and whatever as they were marching them into the courtyard. And now they've been shechted and their bodies are kind of hanged on these racks over here, on these on the hangers. And the kids have their part of kind of taking out the parts that you don't eat from the sheep, and the fur is all plucked and shaved and whatever it is. And then eventually they are roasted on these incredibly hot fire pits that you can see over here. And what's interesting about the Samaritan, about this custom, is that, about this tradition, is that for them, Pesach has to be completed here. The only way that Pesach is completed is if you consume the entire lamb on that night. That you're not allowed to go to sleep that night until the whole lamb is consumed. Oh, David, I forgot to put up the Exodus section. I thought I'd put it up, but I guess I forgot to put up the Exodus quote. Do you want to? I was going to turn the floor over to David now to help teach us a little bit about the source of.
Well, I can even just explain it. Thanks, Josh. Well, and that's where we have this interesting perspective, and I'm glad that you showed that piece from the Samaritans, because like you said, they're really preserving this ancient tradition, this ancient way that the Torah talks about the original Korban Pesach, the original Passover sacrifice. So here's what's interesting. In general, in the Torah, all of the sacrifices happen in the central place of worship. They're going to happen in the desert, in the tabernacle, or once they get to Jerusalem, all the sacrifices transfer from the tabernacle to the temple. That's the way any sacrifice is going to be. There's only one sacrifice mentioned in the entire Torah, which is ever going to happen in people's homes and in people's communities. And that's the Passover sacrifice as it's described in Exodus 12. So if you look back to Exodus 12, that's going to be the night right before Makat Becharot, before the last plague, the plague of the firstborn. The Torah describes the scene where the Israelites are meant to have this Passover offering, where they offer the sacrifice. They spread the blood over the lintel, over the posts of the door, and then they're meant to eat all of this food. And like you said, Josh, there are meant to be no leftovers. There's actually a beautiful piece by Rabbi Shai Held, which talk about how that's meant to be a moment of radical inclusion, right? Where I have my lamb, but it's not possible that, well, maybe my family could eat an entire lamb, because I'm sorry, Judy Tillman, we're like, most of us are pretty big carnivores, and my brother Josh is vegan, but many of the rest of us are big meat eaters. But for most families, what you would all need to do is invite other families with you. And it's meant to show a radical, welcoming hospitality, is the holiday of Passover. But so what's interesting here is Passover in some ways stands out from the rest of the holidays, where the original law of Passover is, do it with your family and do it with your community wherever you are. And eventually, it's in Deuteronomy and later on where the later Torah and the later tradition is going to say, you know what, those home-based rituals should in some way transfer to the temple. What's interesting is after the temple is destroyed, all of those pieces about the temple transfer back to our homes, right? The Seder is one of the most observed holidays in the Jewish community today. And one of the reasons that is because I think it actually stems back to that piece in Exodus, that we're meant to gather with our immediate family. We're meant to gather with our immediate group of people, to also welcome in those who don't have a place, and to figure out how to celebrate in that way. So Josh, I'll pass it back to you, but with that tension in mind of, on the one hand, the beginning of Exodus talking about how Passover sacrifices happen in your own home, and how eventually that gets transferred to the temple, which is going to be a lot of the topic today. But then later on in our tradition, we bring it back to the home.
So thanks, Duty, Rabbi Russo. So to continue this kind of tradition about, I mean, Pesach is a bit of a complicated relationship with the temple, as David was saying, that on the one hand, it's a family holiday, but on the other hand, it's also this kind of national holiday as well. And so what's interesting to me as well is that in Israel, Pesach is basically, it serves that same purpose. I mean, just like everywhere in the Jewish world, it serves that same purpose. And the old city on non-COVID years gets completely flooded with pilgrims that come to Jerusalem and specifically to go to the Western Wall. Now, between 1948 and 1967, of course, there was no access for Jews to go to the Western Wall. And the closest place they could get to was King David's tomb, which is this building that we're on the roof of over here. So they would come to this spot that's over here, which is in the old city. It's part of the Armenian quarter, but it's actually out of the old city walls. So they could get to this spot that's over here, and they could see kind of off in the distance a little bit of kind of the old city. You can't really see the Kotel, but you can catch a glimpse from the right spot, the right angle. You can catch a glimpse of at least the Dome of the Rock and the Temple Mount. Now, what's interesting about this spot that's over here is a tradition that started on the Shalosh Regalim, but specifically on Pesach as well. Where in this little tiny room over here, there was this little tiny room was given to the President Weizmann, the first president of Israel. But after Weizmann died just 2 years on the job, the Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the second president of Israel, takes this room and actually starts to use it. And he goes into this room and he starts to come every single holiday of the 3 holidays. And when people would come to the room and they would get a bracha from the president. So here's President Ben-Zvi over here on the stamp that you can see over here. You can also see him on the 100 shekel bill. For any of you who remember from the C2C tour, we talked a little bit about Yitzhak Ben-Zvi and how he's just kind of the greatest person ever. But so you have all these people who would come on the Shalosh Regalim and they would get a bracha from Yitzhak Ben-Zvi and they would leave various memorabilia. They would leave trinkets from whether it was things that they had parents who were Holocaust survivors, that they brought things that they had carried with them through the Shoah, or things from lost loved ones or whatever it was, and they would bring it together with Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, and in a way, all of the people of Israel would come and they would get a blessing from Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, but that all the people essentially would leave some sort of artifact with them with Yitzhak Ben-Zvi so that he could celebrate it together. And this is all based on kind of what David was talking about here, and I'll let David kind of take over here, which is understanding the Shalosh Regalim and the meaning of the Shalosh Regalim of people all coming to Jerusalem during these 3 festivals and getting blessings.
Yeah, so you can see in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 16, we read Shalosh Pamim Bashana Yera'eh Kol Zchorcha Epnei Adonai Elohecha B'makom Asher Yivchar. That 3 times a year everybody was meant to gather B'makom Asher Yivchar, in the place that God has chosen, meaning the temple. B'Chag HaMatzot on Passover, Chag HaShavuot, the Shavuot holiday, and Chag HaSukkot. V'lo Yera'eh Pnei Adonai Rekam. But also, like, don't come empty. You gotta come and bring a gift to God, right? It's going to be a big sacrifice moment, and not just for animals, right? Whether it was going to be fruits and vegetables and various offerings. There are all these amazing midrashim, these rabbinic imagination stories. I was trying to imagine how could the whole area have had enough space for all of these pilgrims who are all going to get there. And there are midrashim, rabbinic stories that said magically the temple area in Jerusalem would expand as it absorbed more pilgrims who were all coming. But this was not only a religious experience, like Josh, you were starting to allude to. This was a major social communal gathering. I guess if you imagine like the high holidays now, but like multiply that by thousands and thousands of people and imagine a lot, even more like food and communal celebration. That it was really this incredible gathering social time that everybody had together on these 3 particular pilgrimage holidays. Pass it back to Josh.
All right, great. So let's actually get onto the Temple Mount. We've spoken all about what it means to go to the Temple Mount on the holidays. So what's on the Temple Mount? What is up here today? So first of all, I guess let me just take you back for a quick second to this slide for a second. The tour that we're going to be doing on the Temple Mount is basically going to start here in the southwest corner, which is the only place that, if you're a non-Muslim, this is the only entrance available to non-Muslims. There's around 9 or 10 entrances to go on the Temple Mount all around the western and the northern walls. but only one of them is, again, accessible for non-Muslims, and only during certain times of day and only during certain days of the week. And then after that, we're going to go into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We're going to hang out over here on the southeastern corner. We're going to pop over here to the Golden Gate. We're going to pop to the northern side over here. We're going to go around the Dome of the Rock, and then we're going to go finally into the Dome of the Rock itself. So to start in the southwest corner, I'm already going to start explaining a little bit about what I mentioned before about how the Temple Mount is this place where there's this dialogue that takes place between the centuries and between the different traditions. And you can see on this corner, there's what's called a minaret, or this one is particularly the Al-Fakharia minaret, which is the second oldest of the 4 minarets that adorn the Temple Mount, but is the one that is in a way most seen by people outside of the old city of Jerusalem and most heard by the rest of Jerusalem. All 4 of the minarets have loudspeakers, but this one, because it's right next to the valley, the sound carries way further than the rest of the minarets in Jerusalem, announcing the call to prayer for Muslims all over the city. And what's interesting is that exactly on this corner, exactly on the southwest corner, on the ground was found this stone over here, which says Lebeit Hatkiya, which means to the house of calling of blowing the shofar. Now this is the place where every Shabbat, before Shabbat, a shofar would be blown to announce the beginning of Shabbat. A shofar would be blown to announce the ending of Shabbat. A shofar would be blown to announce the beginning of Rosh Chodesh, of the new month. This is the spot, the same spot there's a minaret, unbeknownst to the people who built the minaret right there, but that this corner piece that was toppled over by the Romans, that this is a place that you can now see it in the Israel Museum. But this is, again, the stone that was used by Jews as well in order to, call to prayer, if you will, or call to holy times. And so now we're standing right in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, I mentioned before, has fallen over a number of times because of earthquakes, most recently in 1927, where every 100 years in Israel, there's a massive earthquake that destroys like half the country. And if you're doing your math, the last big one was in 1927. So hold on tight. So what do we have over here is the pictures that the British archaeologists managed to take during the reconstruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque after the earthquake. And some of these pillars over here are made out of wood. And wood you can carbon date. You can't carbon date stone. And a lot of these pieces of wood, especially these wood carvings that were found kind of underneath the mosque over here, date back not just 2,000 years, which these ones date back 2,000 years, but these slabs of wood over here actually date back 2,700 years, which means that there are pieces of wood that there's evidence in a way of gorgeous building and kind of fancy wood carving up on the Temple Mount that date back to the first temple period. You can see kind of the damage of, again, this the Al-Aqsa Mosque from the earthquake that's over here. And again, it's just really interesting to look at it in that way. Now, across the way from us is the Dome of the Rock, which sits on the bedrock of the Temple Mount itself. And I'll explain why this sits on the bedrock and not the Al-Aqsa Mosque in just a second. But that's why the Dome of the Rock has survived for 1,400 years, while the Al-Aqsa Mosque has not, and that's fallen over a bunch of times. Now, because it fell over a bunch of times, again, in 1927, after the earthquake, so who helps to donate for the reconstruction for the Al-Aqsa Mosque? None other than Benito Mussolini, who brings all of these fancy pillars that you can see, all these marble and granite pillars from Rome to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, some of you might be saying, wow, it's really funny because the last time that the Temple Mount was really destroyed, a lot of the goods came back to Rome. So in a way, this is Rome giving back to the Temple Mount what once was there. Now, inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, non-Muslims are not allowed to enter, even if you go up to the Temple Mount itself. So you can't enjoy the beautiful, stunning artwork and architecture that's on the inside of the mosque. This is the largest mosque in all of Israel. And according to Muslim tradition, inside a mosque, you're not allowed to draw images of faces or animals or landscapes. So a Muslim artist who has a lot of great ability, you can see they show it off with incredible calligraphy and with geometric patterns and all these different beautiful colors that they're able to use. Now, right next to the mihrab, which is the direction of prayer towards the south, towards Mecca, there's what's called the minbar, which is where the imam speaks from the pulpit on Fridays. Now, this minbar over here is fine and good and looks really nice, but what it used to be was even more beautiful. And this is the minbar as it used to be, which was built in 1187 after Salah ad-Din defeated the Crusaders and basically kicked them out of Jerusalem. And so he built this minbar to commemorate that. Now, a deranged tourist in 1969 ends up torching the minbar. And it's because of that tourist that non-Muslims were not allowed to enter into the Al-Aqsa Mosque ever since then. And you can see that because of its size and the carpeting and kind of how relaxing it is, that during the hot summer months of Ramadan, when Ramadan is in the summer, this is obviously a place where a lot of people come to just enjoy a little bit of the cool air. And here we are now on the southeastern corner. Now, there's a bit of a myth about the Western Wall, that the Western Wall is the holiest wall the holiest place in the world for Jews because it's the last remaining wall of the temple. But the southern wall, completely standing. The eastern wall that we're standing on top of right now, completely standing. The northern wall is a little bit more complicated because it wasn't ever really that much of a wall, but that's besides the point. All of it still is standing. What are these big walls over here? They weren't actually the walls of the temple. Let's go peel away all the layers of the Temple Mount just so we understand everything here. First things first, this is Mount Moriah, the mountain of the Temple Mount. If you strip absolutely everything away, this little top part that's over here, this is the top where the Dome of the Rock stands on top of, where the Holy of Holies of the temple was, the holiest place in the world for Jews once was. So if we fast forward a little bit in time, this is the Temple of Solomon, where again, you can see that the Holy of Holies, the place where only the high priest would go in once a year. So that sits exactly on that little tiny rock that's on the top of this mountain over here. And we have a palace that's over, we have not a palace, a Temple Mount structure that you can see over that was built on top of it that was modest, but one that was, according to the biblical tradition, incredibly beautiful. And now the second temple, as it was rebuilt, was likely larger than the area of the first temple. However, it was something that was not as pretty. You can notice that it's much simpler because they didn't have as much money they didn't have enough money to really build everything as it was. Here's again, everything kind of peeled apart a little bit. Where the first temple period, this is the Temple Mount, where there isn't really that, this is the yellow area, this yellow square that's over here. The Hashmonaim, who build essentially the third temple, but the renovation on the second temple, expand the area of the first temple and the second temple to be all the way out here to the red. You can see how large the expansion was of Herod's, that it's all the way out to here.
Well, now, Josh, if I can pause you a second just to give people a sense of timeline. So when you say that first temple period, right, that yellow one, we're talking about around like 700 BCE, right?
From 900 BCE approximately to around 586 BCE.
Okay, and then the red one, which you're saying is the Hasmonean expansion, so that's expanded around like 200 BCE, something like that, 150?
150, yeah.
Yeah, and then the Herodian expansion, that's like 50 years later?
The Herodian expansion starts around 20 BCE.
Got it.
All right. And so you can see just how massive this Herodian expansion is. It's over here. When we're talking about what the Western Wall is, the Western Wall that we go to with that huge plaza is just this little stretch over here. So you can see how minuscule the Western Wall plaza is compared to the whole rest of the Western Wall. Now, part of the reason why the Western Wall is the holier wall in a way that we go to is that it is the closest to this spot, which is where the Holy of Holies stood. Because the southern wall and the northern wall are obviously a little bit further away. The eastern wall is on a cliff, so it's harder to actually get to. So the western wall over here is much more naturally the place where Jews would go to pray at in order to be closer to where the Holy of Holies once stood. But again, it's not the last surviving wall. It is one of 4 supporting walls that supported the whole structure of the Temple Mount. Now, what do I mean by supporting walls? In order to fill in all this gap, all these huge spaces that is left over here, Herod essentially builds these massive arches that on the top of those arches builds a platform. So if you look at it over here, sorry, one second, that's not what I wanted to show you. Nope, not this either. Sorry, there's a lot of things to show. Let me just get to it. Nope, not this one. This one over here. So here's Mount Moriah, and the Temple Mount goes on the top of that. Here's Mount Moriah with Herod's walls. So again, you can see all these kind of empty spaces that need to be filled in order to build a flat platform. So here it is now filled. And how is it filled? Again, there's all these arches that sit underneath that platform that's right over there. Now, that means the consequence of that is that the Dome of the Rock itself, again, sits on the bedrock, while the Al-Aqsa Mosque is floating on all of these arches. Where you can see the arches to this day, well, we can't, but Muslims can see the arches to this day underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which look like this, which were named by the Crusaders in the 12th century. They renamed these arches and these big, huge areas underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they renamed them Solomon's Stables. Why they renamed them Solomon's Stables? Because the Al-Aqsa Mosque was converted by the Crusaders into the palace of the King of Jerusalem, while the Dome of the Rock over here was converted into a church, naturally. But the king has to have a place to keep his horses, and the arches that are just down below look pretty natural to be horses' stables. So if the Christian king of the Crusades in the 12th century keeps his horses down here, so of course this is where Solomon must have kept his horses, even though these arches weren't built, were built 900 years after Solomon would have built the first temple. But again, this isn't the first time or the last time that the Crusaders made some sort of, huge historical error or anything like that, but that would never stop them in general. But I guess it's just another little thing of note is that since the Oslo Accords, Israel made a requirement for a fire escape to be put underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque on this side over here. So there was essentially a lot of digging taking place. They're digging underneath the Temple Mount, which most of the things that were dug out, because it was underneath the Jordanian Authority, were dumped in huge piles. Some of those piles are on the Temple Mount itself. Some of them are scattered kind of all over Jerusalem, where there's a project that's called the Temple Mount Sifting Project that basically sifts through all of that dirt in order to try to find, artifacts, Jewish and not Jewish alike. One of the seals that they found from the first temple period is this one over here, Eliyahu ben Imer, which is just a name that appears in the book of Jeremiah, which is just kind of interesting to point out over here. Now we are further along the eastern wall, and we've made it to the Golden Gate. Now, the Golden Gate is a place that is equally holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. So it's really one of my favorite places to take people to on the Temple Mount, and one that is often forgotten about. Now, what is so special about this place? Now, for Jews, there's a tradition that when the Messiah comes, he or she will go down on their donkey through the Mount of Olives, resurrecting all the Jewish dead bodies that are on the Mount of Olives, which is why the Mount of Olives is such hot real estate for anyone who wants to be buried in the best place in the world for Jews. Got to be buried here, because when the Messiah comes, you'll be first to get resurrected. So the Messiah comes and resurrects all the bodies that are over here on the Mount of Olives, and then enters through the Temple Mount and starts the project, announces the new rebuilding of the temple. Now, as you might notice, there's a problem over here. There's no gate. You can't enter. So how are they going to enter? And why is it blocked up in the first place? So this Jewish notion gained a gained a lot of popularity, especially with Christians, because if you can look in the distance over here, there's a little tiny church over there that's called the Dominus Flevit. I'll show you a close-up image in just a minute. But that image over there is of when that church that's over there commemorates when Jesus looks and weeps over the future destruction of the temple. And after that moment, Jesus goes down on a donkey and enters through the Golden Gate over here. Well, pilgrims, Christian and Jewish pilgrims for centuries, were reenacting these ideas of, whether they're declaring themselves the Messiah or waiting for the Messiah, that they would do that trek that the Messiah would eventually do. And come the 800s, the Muslims who ruled this area said, enough of all this. We're going to stop this tradition. And they block up the Golden Gate. Now, this only adds to the uniqueness of the gate, because now the Messiah isn't just going to walk through the gate, but the Messiah is going to blast through the gate and burst through all the walls. And that idea, that notion, gains a special popularity with Muslims too. That, wow, this great prophet or this great Messiah is going to come and blast through the walls and announce the dawning of the new age. So maybe for Muslims, there's a tradition like that too. And there's a new tradition that starts around the 9th century for Muslims, that when the end of days comes, Jesus and Muhammad will sit in this gate that you can see people praying in. They can see Muslims praying into this day. They will sit inside this gate and judge the people as they walk through the gate. So again, you have this amazing site that is equally holy and special to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. It is currently a place that is, again, off limits to non-Muslims for a number of reasons that unfortunately I don't have enough time to get into with you right now. Now, scattered all over the Temple Mount are all these little domes everywhere. And the dome that I wanted to focus with you on is this one, which doesn't really look like much. But this dome over here preserves this really cool tradition that was started by Muslims in the 12th century, that underneath this dome are a few stones from the first temple, that when the Jews had left Jerusalem from the first temple's destruction in 586 BCE, they took with them stones from the temple to Babylon. And those who came back to rebuild the temple brought back some of those stones from the first temple. And it is this dome over here, which is called the Dome of Solomon, protects some of those stones from Solomon's temple. And now let's get closer to the Dome of the Rock itself. So what is this Dome of the Rock? We'll get to it in just a quick second. But I wanted to focus about the dome next to the Dome of the Rock, which is just over here, which originally was actually a Christian baptismal pool built by the Crusaders, which you can see from the really beautiful Gothic architecture that you can see on the top over here, where each of these little knobbly stone things that's on the top of the dome is actually a different animal carved in the stone, which is just absolutely stunning and really beautiful. Now, this spot over here, according to Muslim tradition, is the spot where Muhammad ascended to heaven originally. Eventually, that tradition ends up moving to being inside the Dome of the Rock itself. Traditions kind of move and kind of different places all over the Temple Mount all the time. But the first time that it's a tradition that Muhammad goes to Jerusalem, and specifically to the Temple Mount, to ascend to heaven, to debate with God and Moses and Jesus and Abraham, and to understand a number of different laws for Muslims, but specifically about how many times a day Muslims should pray. And that is one of the reasons why this site is especially holy to Muslims. But that tradition is relatively new, where it's essentially only brought to the spot in the 11th century, which again is relatively new. The real reason for why the Jerusalem specifically, but the Temple Mount is holiest to Muslims, why is the third holiest city in the world for Muslims, third holiest spot in the world for Muslims, is that it is this building, the Dome of the Rock, which is not a mosque, it's actually a shrine to the Temple of Solomon, that this spot is the original direction of prayer for Muslims. That for 2 years, Muhammad receives that prophecy from God that the direction of prayer for Muslims should be towards the Temple of Solomon. 2 years later, there's a new prophecy that the direction of prayer should be towards the Kaaba. But just because there was a new prophecy that replaced it doesn't mean that the old tradition is completely thrown out. It's still considered to be this really special place because it is that first direction of prayer. And part of what's really special about the Muslim traditions on the Temple Mount itself is that often they preserve something of the Jewish traditions that were up on the Temple Mount, including this dome, which is one of the prettier domes, even if it is kind of modest and small. Now, this dome that's over here is called the Kubat Aluach. Now, why is it called the Kubat Aluach? For any of you who have a keen ear for Arabic or Hebrew, Luach is like in Hebrew for like Luach or Luchot Habrit, the tablets of the law. That maybe, just maybe, this dome has something to do with where the tabernacle once stood. Indiana Jones should have come here. Why should Indiana Jones have come here? This dome is special because it is the only place on the whole Temple Mount complex, other than inside the Dome of the Rock itself, where you can actually see the bedrock of Mount Moriah, of the mountain itself. And this dome protects that bedrock. And maybe, based on the preservation of the name by calling it the Kubat Aluach, the Kubat of the dome of the tabernacle, of the dome of the tabernacle, if you will, the dome of the Ten Commandments, that maybe it's preserving a tradition that this is actually the spot where the temple once stood and not where the Dome of the Rock is, which is an interesting theory and one that has enough weight that when religious Jews go up to the Temple Mount, they will not go on the northern part of the platform of the Temple Mount out of concern that maybe this isn't just the only tradition where the Holy of Holies was, but maybe this is where the Holy of Holies was, and you have to be a high priest in order to approach certain areas to get closer, or a priest to get to this a little bit close, not at the place, but a little bit further away, or a ritually pure man in order to get to another area that's relatively close to the dome. So there's kind of a number of different traditions that kind of have the Temple Mount that kind of show that, again, holiness sometimes shifts and moves, sometimes far away and sometimes close. And it's not that. And again, it's lost in history, but it's something that is important to remember. Now, I wanted to spin around from the Dome of the Rock over here to show you again the Mount of Olives. Now, off in the distance over here, direct line from the Mount of Olives, or from the Dome of the Rock, is that church, that Dominus Flevit church, which is designed to look like this teardrop, to reflect, again, that story of Jesus weeping over the Temple Mount. Now, we look over here at the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome of the Rock, and it's protected by this funny-looking dome over here, which is called the Kubat al-Sisla, or the Chain Dome, which we don't know the real reason why it's built here, but the general theory is that it was, sorry, one second. I need to show one second. Here we go. Now, the Kubat al-Sisla sits in the actual geometric center of the Temple Mount complex. So here's a zoomed out version of the Temple Mount of the second temple period, where you can see the Holy of Holies actually sits a little bit to the west of the Temple Mount complex. And just over here in this courtyard, this is actually the geometric center of, it's okay, Abby is back and she is here to take care of Adva, so we don't have to have any tears anymore. So the Kubat al-Sisla sits right over here in the geometric center of the Temple Mount complex, which maybe that's the reason that Muslims really love their geometry, they really love their symmetry and things like that. So the Dome of the Rock, even though it sits on the place where the Holy of Holies was, the Kubat al-Sisla sits in another special place as well. And that Kubat al-Sisla was so famous and mesmerizing for the Crusaders when they arrived that it was included on the seal of the Knights Templar, the most powerful, the most important of all of the monastic dynasties, monastic orders in the Crusader period in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries and beyond. So the Kubat al-Sisla was on that original seal of the Knights Templar. But let's go. Oh, wait, I wanted to show you one more thing while we're over here. So, do you know what? I'm going to show you something that's a little bit of a better version of that over here. So now let's go inside of the Dome of the Rock. This is what we're all here for. This is a place that's off limits to all non-Muslims. And here we are. This rock that's just down below us over here is the holiest site in the world for Jews. This is the place where the Holy of Holies once stood. To get a little bit of a view from above, This is what it looks like from above, where there's a number of different, it kind of looks a bit funny, this stone, where it's not just kind of a natural looking rock. You can see that it's been carved up and hacked away at over the centuries. This hole that's over here was likely a baptismal pool during the time that it was a church. This cutout spot over here is theorized that this is the place where the tabernacle once stood, but we don't exactly know. These little cutout places over here might be places where Jews, Muslims, and Christians would come and take a little piece of the holiest rock in the world and bring it back with them. Now, why is this rock so holy? This is the rock that, according to Jewish tradition, the whole world was born from this rock. And after that, this is the site where Abraham goes to sacrifice his son Isaac. And this after that, that Solomon is told that this is the place where the temple should be built. Now, inside of the dome itself, again, the interior of the dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque was even more beautiful than the dome on the outside. The interior of the Golden Dome is even more stunning on the inside than it is on the outside. It is absolutely stunning. You can see the beautiful calligraphy and you can see the beautiful geometric patterns. And that little section I'm showing you right there is just the inside of the dome. And if you look at it more kind of a high quality image, hold on, oops. Again, you can see kind of all along the sides just how beautiful and intricate all the different patterns are around the Temple Mount itself, all around the Dome of the Rock itself. And again, this stone that you can see in the high quality image, from not from right above, but from the side image, it does still look like it's some sort of special rock that is, again, the foundation stone, the holiest site in the world for Jews. Now, underneath the stone is a little bit of an interesting story. Underneath the stone is actually the only place that is officially a mosque within the shrine of the Dome of the Rock. As you can see, all these people here who are praying. Now, to get a little bit more of a zoomed out image, underneath the stone is actually a cave, which is known as this Well of Souls. Now, we don't know what use the cave had during the times of the First and Second Temple, but when the Crusaders roll around in the 12th century, they see a cave underneath the dome of the rock, and they say, "Wow, that's really interesting." Because churches in Europe, the holiest place in a church is never the altar where the mass takes place, but it's underneath the altar where the church is based on. There's some sort of crypt. There's some sort of the bones of a holy person or a famous relic or something that's very holy that is the basis of the church. So when the Crusaders come to the Dome of the Rock, they say that's very nice that there's this rock on the top, but our church is at home. The holiest site is underneath, and you have a cave underneath here, which means that this must be the place that the tabernacle once stood. And that is a tradition that is held to this day by Christians and Muslims alike. And what's interesting is that there's a British archaeologist who in the 1800s managed to not just go down to the Well of Souls and poke around a little bit, but realize that underneath the Well of Souls, there was another little open space. Now, no one since the 1800s has been able to verify this as being true. But according to this archaeologist, there's this kind of open space that's underneath over here and a tunnel that takes potentially water to flow through underneath the Dome of the Rock. Then maybe this is a place that the Kohanim, the priests, would use to cleanse things, to have access to water directly in the Temple Mount itself. And recently, like just in the last year or two, there was some retiling done on this area where the Well of Souls is, and they uncovered these beautiful marble tilings that date back to the Crusader period. So that's just a really cool thing with that. Now, we went inside the Dome of the Rock and we had a really beautiful view in there, but now I wanted to kind of finish our time together here because we're getting closer to the end.
Now, Josh, I just want to, one of the things that I know you told me, and I know I'm pushing us on time, but one of the cool things that you mentioned to me is just how what we consider to be holy space might change and move around, right? So I think you all probably picked up on that from Josh's presentation, but I was really struck by that when Josh was talking to me about it, that there might be what we imagine to be the important place for Jews as the Holy of Holies, which might begin as a holy place for other religions, and then other places might be imbued with holiness. That holy place might move to being right underneath into a cave, or to Jews might eventually move out towards the Kotel, to the Western Wall. So what we consider to be this holy space or the holiest space sometimes changes, whether it's because of time or because of different interpretations or because of different religious traditions. And that's a cool thing to watch that trajectory and change.
Right. And sometimes it's on purpose, and sometimes it's, something that is forced upon you. So again, the temple stood, let's say, for approximately 800 years, which was definitely the holiest place in the world for Jews. But after the temple was destroyed in the year 70, the whole Temple Mount complex is turned into a garbage dump. And Jews are not allowed to go up during the Christian period from the 300s until the Muslim conquest. Jews are not even allowed to go up to the Temple Mount except for one day of the year. David, can you guess which day of the year it is?
Pesach?
Nope. Because that would be a nice thing to allow Jews to go up during Pesach.
Oh, so Tisha B'Av, maybe?
Tisha B'Av, exactly. It was a way to laugh at the Jews going up to the Temple Mount when they're the day of mourning over the destruction of the temple, so they could go up to the Temple Mount to see how destroyed and how terrible of a place it is, that it's not holy anymore. Now, for Christians, once it was destroyed, when they built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site, as I mentioned, for Christians, they literally take the traditions of the temple and they say, that is the Old Testament. That's where the Old Temple is. And here's the New Temple. Here's the New Testament. And even though they know that it's not the physical space where the temple once stood, the holiness of the temple for Christians literally shifted down the road to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where there's a mosaic in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that is of the sacrifice of Isaac, that they even transformed that story to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, moving it from Mount Moriah. And as I mentioned before, again, about different shifting of Muslim holiness, but for Jews, again, the Temple Mount was the holiest site in the world for Jews for, let's say, 900 years or so. But after that, they needed a new place. And the Western Wall was the place that Jews had access to. And now for 2,000 years straight, the holiest site in the world for Jews has been that Western Wall, which is nothing to sneeze at. When people say, oh, no, it's not really the holiest site in the world. The holiest site in the world for Jews is the Holy of Holies. Yeah, but again, 900 years versus 2,000 years, and a lot of generations coming and praying at that spot and feeling that connection. Where if you surveyed, I wonder if Pew ever surveyed this with Jews about what is the holiest site in the world for Jews. I imagine at least half of the Jewish population in the world would say that the holiest site in the world for Jews is the Western Wall, is the Kotel. Again, it kind of shows again how holiness is dynamic. Holiness shifts with time. And with all those shifts, it just kind of goes to show that Jerusalem is a place that you can imagine in any number of different ways. You can go and you can look at the Dome of the Rock and you can see the Second Temple. You can go to the you can go to the old city of Jerusalem and only imagine it as this kind of pastoral image, like what you can see in this image from the 1930s, where the Dome of the Rock wasn't even gold yet. It was still, it's lead dome that you can see in kind of that kind of way. And I find that the best way to sum up our whole experience here on the Temple Mount, after we've mentioned, in passing, how many times the Temple Mount has shifted hands and shifted holiness and all these different things, and people fighting over different parts of land, and people having this shared holiness. But really, when you say shared holiness, it means competing holiness. Well, there's one song, there's a Canadian folk song. It's called One Tin Soldier, that I find really best exemplifies the story of not just Jerusalem, but of the Temple Mount itself. And I hope you guys enjoy having a quick listen to this.
Listen, children, to a story that was written long ago about a kingdom on a mountain and the valley folk below. On the mountain tin soldier rides away. So the people of the valley sent a message up the hill, asking for the buried treasure, tons of gold for which they kill. Came an answer from the kingdom, with our brothers we will share all the secrets of our mountain, all the riches buried there. Now the valley cried with anger, mount your horses, draw your sword, and they killed the mountain people, so they won their just reward. Now they stood beside the treasure on the mountain, dark and red, turned the stone and looked beneath it. Peace on earth was all it said. Go ahead and meet your neighbor.
It's always nice to add a little bit of Canadian content to the tours, just to remind David that he's got 2 citizenships. He's not just a Chicagoan. He's not even originally from Chicago, all you people. But that's all besides the point. I find that song is just, I've always found it very moving. It's always been a song that I've connected to, a song that was very popular at Camp Rama, that people would sing all the time, that we would play guitar to and whatever it was. But when designing this tour specifically, the virtual tour here of the old city of Jerusalem and of the Temple Mount specifically, it really made me think of that song, that the treasure of Jerusalem is peace. And the city Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, comes from the word Ir Shalom, a city of peace, which ironically very rarely ever knows any peace. That all through its generations, all through the time periods of Jerusalem, it is very rare. Sorry if you can hear baby crying in the background. Sorry, she's getting taken care of. That throughout all these generations, you know, every 100 years, 200 years, there's a new wave of people that come and conquer Jerusalem, and they build their thing that's supposed to last all the next however many centuries in order to glorify God in their way and to adopt and steal and take, you know, from other traditions and make sure that it's part of their own religion. And I guess the point of the tour today is to try to show that the Temple Mount here is a huge space. And the coolest aspect of the Temple Mount is that there's a shared holiness and there's a dialogue in the holiness, and that whether it's mistakes of identity or whether it's, you know, shifting dynamic holiness and whatever it is, there's some sort of dialogue that takes place that's really special. And if only we viewed it as a special dialogue and not as a competing dialogue, maybe there would really be an Ir Shalom, city of peace in Jerusalem. Now, for any of you who want to read more about the Temple Mount or Jerusalem in general, I'd recommend reading Jerusalem, the Biography by Simon Sebag Montefiore, which is the greatest book about Jerusalem ever written, which is essentially just goes through the whole timeline of Jerusalem in a very like tangible, very like friendly, user-friendly way to look at it, where it's about the people. It's not about like, you know, just the big kings, but it's trying to understand who the people who lived in Jerusalem for the last 3,000 years. You can also read the book by Yossi Klein Halevi, Like Dreamers, which is all about the paratroopers in 1967 who conquered the old city of Jerusalem and freed the Temple Mount, which is also a fantastic and really great nuanced look at those soldiers and look at, you know, conflict in Israel, but also about the Israeli society and about what Jerusalem is all about in general. Another really good book that you can read is this book by the Times of Israel, Times of Israel journalist Sarah Tuttle Singer, who wrote this book called Jerusalem Drawn and Quartered, about her year living in the Old City. So if you want to learn about what the Old City looks like now, what it feels like now, she lived in all 4 quarters and really got to know all the people. And the book is all about her experiences with that. And I'm happy to stay on now and take any and all of your questions, as long as I have permission to just say a quick l'chaim to all of you guys. L'chaim, and happy to stay on for as many questions as you guys have about the Temple Mount. And I'll turn the floor back over to you, Duty.
Well, give me 1 second, everybody. First of all, I just want to thank Josh, and I know a lot of people have to jump off, so thank you so much, Josh, for doing this incredible tour, as always, and opening parts of the world that otherwise we might not see. A few quick announcements. One, we want to make sure you know about all the incredible Passover things that we have coming up, and in particular tonight, we're honored to have Janet Siegel and Cantor David Berger and my wife Rebecca to talk about some of their favorite Passover traditions. So that's going to be tonight at 7:30. We also want to make sure that you all fill in the survey about Cantor Rachel Brooke from this past weekend, and that you look out for our second cantorial candidate, who we're going to be announcing in a couple days for this coming weekend. And we hope that we really need to hear from everybody. It's really important. We want to hear from every member as much as possible from our community to know what people think of these incredible cantorial candidates who are bringing in. So please, please, please fill it in. Get your friends to fill in the survey. Get your enemies to fill it in. It's very important for us. Sorry, only Amy has enemies. Everybody else doesn't. Just a tough crowd. Also,
too late for me to apply.
Yeah, hey, you can give it your best shot. Though I think it's.
I'll audition to everyone right here, right now.
Yeah. Let's hear bust out that guitar that you got over there. And then also just look it up for, and Amy, you can say more, but we've got a lot of other incredible things coming up for Pesach in terms of other ways to learn and connect. So we hope that you'll join us for all of those things. We're so glad to have you all here. And Joy, I see you're eager to jump in.
I have a question since I came an hour late.
You're
Is
good.
there a way that I can see what you just all saw? What do I press?
So the recording will be up by probably by tomorrow afternoon. It will
Oh,
be in the live stream section of the website, or I can send you the link when it's up, Joy. Make it easier
Okay.
for you.
whatever is easier. Thank you. I'm so sorry I came late.
That's okay. We're
No
happy
problem.
to see
So
you.
glad you're here. Well, thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to put a pause on the recording.